Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In this session, I want to step back a little and look at the larger picture so as to put into perspective what may be contributing to the current economic developments we are witnessing both in the United States and globally. I suspect we have finally triggered a major economic tipping point as part of the fourth turning. I'm a long-time blue water sailor, and as such I'm accustomed to plotting my course with regard to both what I see and often can't see. I'm referring here to the difference between the current and the waves. I can see the surging waves, which normally go in the direction of the wind, but I often can't easily identify a slow-moving current, but know it more or less flows directly with the tide. I may sail the shifting wind, but I'm always adjusting for the variables of the current if I have a destination in mind and want to optimize the time to get there. That is what we must do in plotting today's economic environment. We have major long-term changes occurring in the less noticeable demographic variables of population growth, while at the same time piloting the volatile short and intermediate changes in economics to optimize our portfolios. The markets are taking us where the accumulation of all these forces are pointed. As such, I want to discuss the outline shown here. The global population growth has been steadily falling since the 1960s, when the baby boomer generation birth rate peaked. We have now reached the point as a result of technology and various country-specific public policies where global population growth is nearly stagnant. In the U.S., the demographics have reached much the same point of stagnant population growth, having fallen fairly significantly since the 1990s due to a number of factors including slowing immigration, smaller families, and having families later in life. What is most important to economics is the change in the workforce, and as such the working age population. We show here the U.S. population growth between the ages of 25 and 64 and the labor force growth rate over 25 years of age. They correlate, as you would expect, fairly closely on a longer-term basis. On a global basis, the working age population of 15 to 64 years old shows that Japan, Europe, and China have already went negative, while the U.S. is marginally positive. Economic issues are already clearly apparent in Japan, Europe, and China from shifting demographics. There is a direct correlation of a country's economic output with the size of its population and how productive that population is. It is well documented if the population growth of a country is falling, then productivity growth must make up the difference, or the economy also slows. There are many important correlations that go with this fact in the working age of a country's labor force. For example, the decline in the labor force growth rate correlates very closely over the longer term with the U.S. nominal GDP growth rate. The smaller the number of workers will mean less production. The less productive those workers are, the smaller the economic output. The rate of growth of both is a correlated derivative. The Federal Reserve reacts to the demand for money, which changes as the output of the labor force requires. Therefore, the Fed funds rate also follows the same long-term trend, as does long-term rates, as represented here by the 20-year Treasury rate. None of this is useful on anything shorter than an 18 to 24-month basis, but is nevertheless at work, relentlessly like the changing tide is for a sailor. Where this really gets interesting and valuable is when we start to break these numbers down by considering age composition and what is traditionally referred to as the age dependency ratio. We spent a fair amount of time in our recent Under the Lens video entitled The U.S. Labor Market in Productive Decline, along with 2 supporting newsletters on generational attitude shifts. There's a lot of information there that I won't recap here. I encourage you to go through the materials to see how the current demographics of baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, that is the millennials, and Gen Zs, that is the Zoomers, are having on the working age workforce with regard to their attitudes and expectations. Basically, we have a rapidly retiring baby boomer generation, which is being replaced by a Zoomer generation who is entering the labor force much later and indebted, with more education but less skilled and training overall. The result is currently a 5 million shortfall in the labor force. Most important to our discussion is that the current U.S. population, therefore, is experiencing a dominant demographic shift in consumption. This is creating major problems since the U.S. is an unprecedented 70% consumption economy. That number has been falling as an expected result of an older generation spending less, since normally their consumption years start to decline after age 55. Meanwhile, the younger generation, who are in their high consumption years, is weighing in on a smaller degree and later years than has been experienced previously. This additionally is aggravated by heavy student loan obligations. The net result is we have downward pressures on U.S. consumption, which is built on a foundation of consumption. In parallel, we have the dependency ratio headwinds. The age dependency ratio is a measure of the number of dependents aged 0 to 14 and over 65 in a nation compared with its total working age population aged 15 to 64. This demographic indicator gives insights into the number of people of non-working age compared with the number of working age. It is also used to understand the relative economic burden of the workforce and has ramifications for capital availability and taxation. The dependency ratio is also referred to as a total or youth dependency ratio. The U.S. age dependency ratio is shown here. It is represented such that when it falls, there is an increasing burden being placed on the working force by the non-working force age group. The reason this occurs is primarily associated with entitlement programs from Social Security and Medicare to child care and housing assistance benefits from the government. You can see that it is significantly increasing and will continue to get worse through the approaching 30s. This chart doesn't tell the full story, as it fails to reflect the actual funding costs of over $84 trillion of off-balance sheet unfunded liabilities associated with existing social entitlement programs. Additionally, it doesn't reflect the fiscal gap of over $212 trillion of contingent liabilities that may come due in part or whole if the world's economy and globalization in fact slows. The age dependency gap is much worse and pronounced in Europe and Japan. All this adds up to some real problems going forward that are well understood by G7 countries, but are continuously kicked down the road for another administration to deal with. The delay in addressing them has made them almost impossible to envisage how they can be fixed without social anarchy occurring. Real U.S. GDP per capita has dropped precipitously since the dot-com bubble popped in 2000. It hit a low with the COVID-19 recession, but the bounce is already weakening. It appears the best we can hope for is to somehow sustain a GDP per capita 20-year annualized growth rate of between 0.5 and 1.5%. The problem with this level is that it is insufficient to fund the U.S. economy, which I have explained many times is now based on credit growth, the black bars shown here, for sustained consumption, and not savings, the blue bars, for wealth-creating productive assets. Capitalism has given way to creditism. Capitalism is about savings being employed for investment in productive assets, which leads to economic growth and increasing standards of living. What we now have instead of savings is we have credit growth, which is used for consumption versus investment, which leads to lower longer-term standards of living. The U.S. since the 2008 financial crisis has increasingly found it harder to create credit growth at ever increasingly needed and sufficient levels. Quantitative easing, shown in green, by the Fed has helped over the last decade, as has financing from the rest of the world, shown by the red bars. However, financing from the rest of the world, labeled ROW, like China and Russia, has deteriorated badly since 2018, when Russia sold all of its U.S. Treasury FX holdings and China started steadily reducing its rate of buying. My colleague Richard Duncan, which I strongly recommend you subscribe to, is one of the world's leading authorities regarding credit flows and requirements, and as you would expect, does superior work in this area. He has shown that if the U.S.'s annual inflation-adjusted credit growth rate falls below 1.4%, the U.S. consistently suffers a recession. This chart from Richard, dated September of 2021, estimated that U.S. year-over-year credit growth was estimated to possibly be as high as 3.2% in 2022. This at the time was based on inflation being transitory and in fact falling back to 2% by 2022. Well, that myth has been blown apart, and now even if we achieve a 6% annual rate this year, which would be highly unlikely, would make U.S. credit growth negative. We've already seen negative Q1 and Q2 GDP. The problem this chart lays clear is that credit growth in the U.S. will be insufficient and unsustainable at anywhere close to what is required going forward. It is also likely that the recession will last longer and be bigger than most currently envisage. Quantitative easing and debt monetization on steroids may also be insufficient, though you can expect it to be coming in full force. But it may be insufficient if de-dollarization continues its current pace globally. Sanctions against Russia have only accelerated this worrisome trend. There are the strongest indications that this is game, set, match for the U.S. standard of living. Hopefully, as this graphic indicated, we can somehow pull a rabbit out of the hat over the next decade, but be assured it will be a tough decade ahead. What worries me the most about the likelihood of pulling that rabbit out of the hat is something I've often outlined before on a number of occasions, which I have labeled as the event horizon. Stagnation may in fact soon be felt throughout the developed economies. There is little doubt a recession is on the horizon, but the question of an era of stagflation is not to many, at least yet. To me, what is key is to understand that today the potential stagflation problem is much bigger and much more intractable than most yet fully realize. The way to visualize what is occurring is to think of stagflation as a potential black hole. It is easy to unwittingly and unsuspectingly get into, but extremely, if not impossible, to get out of it once trapped in it. The secret is obviously to avoid it with sound economic policies before you reach the event horizon. Many knowledgeable money managers perceive we are potentially entering such a situation. The reaction by central bankers and those in control of monetary policy is to apply traditional Keynesian thinking to the problem, but in this case it doesn't work. What must be done to control inflation crushes growth. What must be done to foster growth inflames inflation. It is the proverbial catch-22. The solution, therefore, is you must identify it early and act aggressively. The hidden problem is that the distortions and reporting games we've been playing for a very long time have let us get much too deep in the black hole than we understand because our measures have failed to alert us to the reality of the situation. The political kick-the-can-down-the-road policy approaches have only fostered tweaking the warning measurements to buy time and to make it someone else's problem. Let me be specific. Inflation through statistical distortions such as hedonics, substitution, imputation, and others, which I have previously chronicled, have distorted inflation as measured by the CPI to such a degree that inflation break-evens, and real rates are ineffective measures. I most recently laid out how the new world of inflation swaps has exploded in an attempt to protect the more sophisticated institutional investors from these mirrors and mirages. Economic growth is also seriously distorted by an obsolete formula that is based on sound money and adopted during the era of the gold standard and fails miserably to adequately describe real growth in an era of massive government debt, transfer payments, and debt-financed consumption, now being nearly 70% of the economy. The creator of this simple formula never imagined an economy like the one we operate in today. Our 2017 thesis paper entitled The Illusion of Growth lays out the indisputable reality of the facts in its 111 pages of detailed analysis. The central problem and difference with what occurred in the 1970s is important to understand. We not only have an order of magnitude worse black hole problem, but our tools are dull and our thinking seriously obsolete. Our politically polarized governance is also a big problem, but which I'll leave for another day. The simple truth and reality is that the U.S. is highly likely to already be well below the event horizon. I have unfortunately presented a pretty bad overall story here so far. I'm sorry to be so negative, but the facts are the facts. I've learned over the years, however, it is never as good as I hope, nor as bad as I expect. We tried to lay out the good news in my recent video entitled "The Dam is Broken" with my colleague Charles Hugh Smith. The bad news is fundamentally about imbalances that must be corrected before we can launch ourselves into a new era of prosperity. The good news is they will herald new and required changes for a more dynamic and productive future. The changes can be expected to be centered on shifts in financial rebalancing between productive countries and indebted, unproductive countries consuming more than they produce. My colleague Charles Hugh Smith's theory on degrowth, reshoring, definancialization, and deglobalization. Developed economies are going to be radically altered because of the impacts of the elements of the shifting demographics we have outlined. The pressure on reduced rates of consumption, the financing costs of ever-increasing debt loads, and shrinking available capital for productive investment versus consumption is going to force the following. We can expect governments to take over more private sector roles through nationalization, or what the U.S. government termed recently conservatorships, during the nationalization of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac during the 2008 financial crisis. Nationalization is always one of the first steps in countries that are going seriously broke. We outlined this evolution in our Under the Lens March feature in 2020, entitled "The Coming Era of Stagflation," which we encourage you to review if you haven't already. We can also expect global conflict to continue to worsen and likely be more intense than even the Cold War. Conflict, however, will take a different form than prior wars and will take the form, we suspect, of continuous currency wars, trade wars, and destabilizing stealth cyber attacks as part of economic warfare. We outlined all of this as on the horizon in our 2020 thesis entitled "Global Conflict," which is available on the Matasi website. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems, until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. The chances of success obviously go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder: do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not necessarily following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2022 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I sincerely thank you for listening.